March 3, 1943, 10:15 a.m., Bismarck Sea, approximately 30 nautical miles northwest of Lae, New Guinea. A Japanese naval officer's hand, blackened with oil, shook as he clung to fragments of the destroyer Arashio's bridge, now reduced to splintered debris. His uniform, soaked with seawater and fuel, mirrored the chaos around him. Through eyes stung by salt, he observed American B-25 Mitchell bombers making repeated passes over a vast stretch of floating wreckage. The surface of the Bismarck Sea was littered with burning remnants of ships, pools of oil, and thousands of Japanese soldiers clinging to anything that could stay afloat. What had once been a confident convoy departing Rabaul only 2 days earlier had been reduced to a scene of utter destruction, and the survivors were only at the beginning of their nightmare. Earlier, on February 28, 1943, the 51st Division of the Imperial Japanese Army, numbering 6,900 men, had boarded 8 transport vessels at Simpson Harbor in Rabaul. Their mission? Reinforce Japanese positions at Lae, New Guinea, and reverse the tide of the campaign. Instead, they were about to confront a level of devastation that would defy their expectations of warfare, disrupt their understanding of honor in combat, and challenge the assumptions instilled by Japanese propaganda about American conduct. The operation had been conceived months earlier. In late December 1942, Japan's Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo began planning reinforcements for New Guinea. Lieutenant General Hoshi Imamurga, commanding the 8th Area Army stationed in Rabaul, faced mounting pressure as Japanese positions weakened. The resulting convoy plan called for 8 destroyers to escort 8 troop transports carrying elite elements of the 51st Division, recently transferred from China. On February 28, 1943, the convoy departed Simpson Harbor escorted by around 100 fighter aircraft. Rear Admiral Masatami Kimura, a seasoned commander with extensive experience in convoy operations, raised his flag aboard the destroyer Shirayuki. Despite his expertise, the operation carried significant risks. Staff simulations conducted by the 18th Army suggested that up to 40% of aircraft could be lost, and nearly half of the transports might not survive the mission. Analysts estimated the overall chance of success at only 50%. By March 1, as the convoy navigated the northern coast of New Britain, the Japanese were first observed by American reconnaissance. A B-24 Liberator from the 91st Bombardment Group appeared overhead. Unknown to the Japanese, their movements had already been anticipated. Allied codebreakers in Melbourne, Fremantle, and Washington, D.C. had intercepted and deciphered Japanese communications, revealing the convoy's departure, intended route, and expected arrival. This intelligence ensured that every maneuver of the Japanese fleet would be closely monitored, setting the stage for the catastrophic engagement that would follow in the Bismarck Sea. At the headquarters of the 5th Air Force, General George Kenney finally received the update he had long anticipated. For several months, his air crews had been refining a groundbreaking combat tactic, known as skip bombing. This method, developed independently by multiple nations during World War II, including Italy, Australia, Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States, enabled aircraft to target ships by bouncing bombs across the water surface, much like a skipping stone. Major Paul Poppy had further enhanced the effectiveness of this strategy by modifying B-25 Mitchell bombers. He installed up to 8 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns in the aircraft's nose, creating heavily armed flying platforms capable of inflicting severe damage on enemy vessels at close range when combined with skip bombing techniques. On the morning of March 2nd, dawn arrived under a blanket of gray clouds. By 1,000 hours, the sky began to clear, revealing 29 B-17 flying fortresses high above. As this formation descended on a Japanese convoy, the outcome was immediate and devastating. A large merchant ship was destroyed, 2 others sustained significant damage, and a destroyer caught fire. The first target to be struck was the Kyoko Maru, transporting 1,500 troops along with barrels of aviation fuel. Pilots of the B-17s observed the vessels splitting apart and sinking rapidly. The transport, weighing 5,493 tons, erupted in a massive fireball, visible to all ships in the convoy. In the aftermath, the destroyers Asagumo and Yukikaze rushed to recover survivors, pulling men coated in oil from the water. While this humanitarian effort saved lives, it simultaneously forced the destroyers to slow down, introducing tactical vulnerability. The following morning, March 3rd, opened with clear skies and ideal conditions for flight. By this point, the convoy had been reduced to 7 transports and 8 destroyers, having traversed nearly 2/3 of its intended route. At precisely 1,000 hours, a coordinated attack struck from multiple angles. Japanese defensive plans collapsed within minutes in the Bismarck Sea near the coast of New Guinea by Lae. The sequence began with B-17s maintaining high altitude, drawing enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire upward. Meanwhile, unnoticed by those focused above, 13 Australian aircraft approached at mast level, unleashing their 8 forward-firing guns and sweeping the decks of the remaining ships. In roughly 15 minutes, the Japanese convoy suffered catastrophic losses, marking a decisive moment in the Pacific theater. Following them, the specially adapted B-25 bombers descended to extremely low altitudes, skimming just above the water so closely that their propeller wash disturbed the surface. The technique known as skip bombing demonstrated extraordinary lethality. Bombs released in this manner would bounce across the water like stones before either striking the side of a vessel or sinking momentarily and detonating alongside it. Captain Ed Lana, commanding the 90th Squadron's modified B-25s, maneuvered his aircraft toward the transport ship Teomaru at near wave-level height. Using his forward-facing guns, he quickly neutralized the ship's anti-aircraft defenses. The bombs he dropped skipped twice over the water before impacting the Teomaru's hull at the waterline. The result was catastrophic. The 6,870-ton transport split apart and sank within a few minutes. By 10:15 a.m., just 15 minutes after the first wave of attacks began, all 7 Japanese transport ships had been struck, and several were already taking on water. 3 of the escorting destroyers were severely damaged or had been destroyed. Among them, the destroyer Shirayuki, serving as Admiral Kimura's flagship, suffered a direct hit that detonated its forward ammunition magazine, obliterating the ship in a massive explosion. By noon on March 3, the waters of the Bismarck Sea were engulfed in chaos. Oil fires raged across the surface, mixing with debris and thousands of soldiers struggling in the water. Many of the survivors were exhausted sailors or injured soldiers clinging to wreckage, while others could not swim. Conservative estimates suggested that over 3,000 men were adrift in the burning, fuel-slicked waters. The 4 remaining destroyers, Yukikaze, Asagumo, Uranami, and Shikinami, initiated rescue efforts. Approximately 2,700 men were retrieved and transported to Rabaul, though the destroyer's capacity to save everyone was limited. Later that afternoon, at 2 p.m., Allied aircraft returned to the area, and the survivors initially believed they were approaching to document the devastation. Their relief quickly turned to terror when the planes flew at wave-top altitude and commenced strafing. Over several days, Allied aircraft including B-25s, A-20 Havocs, and fighter bombers patrolled the waters, repeatedly attacking survivors in lifeboats. From the American tactical viewpoint, this was intended to prevent any Japanese soldiers from reaching shore and reinforcing positions on New Guinea. General Kenny had issued clear instructions. No Japanese combatant was to survive the operation and land alive. For those Japanese soldiers in the water, these actions shattered the traditional expectations of honorable warfare. The Bushido Code emphasized treating defeated foes with respect, but the reality they faced was a brutal violation of that principle.
As night fell on March 3rd, U.S. Navy PT boats entered the operational area. 10 patrol torpedo boats, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Barry Hadgins, actively hunted survivors throughout the night. Their searchlights swept across the water, revealing clusters of men in the dark, while the vessel's machine guns added further devastation. The combined air and naval assault left the Bismarck Sea as a scene of widespread destruction, with oil fires, debris, and hundreds of casualties, marking one of the most devastating naval encounters in the Pacific campaign. After locating the damaged transport Oaba Maru, PT Boats 43 and 150 launched torpedoes, ensuring the ship remained afloat only briefly before sinking. This action forced more Japanese personnel into the water, where they were confronted by a new and terrifying threat. As night fell, sharks, attracted to the chaos and the scent of blood, began attacking the struggling survivors. Those who had managed to endure the initial sinking and strafing attacks now faced mortal danger from the sea itself. By the morning of March 4, the full magnitude of the catastrophe became apparent. Debris from the destroyed convoy extended across roughly 40 miles of open ocean. Scattered among the wreckage were small clusters of survivors, many having endured over 20 hours exposed to the elements and the water. At sunrise, American aircraft returned to the scene, resuming attacks with relentless intensity. On that day, Allied forces dispatched both torpedo boats and aircraft to patrol the area. The operation targeted any movement in the water, including Japanese survivors and vessels attempting rescues. B-25s, A-20s, P-38 Lightning fighters, and bow fighters carried out systematic assaults on the remaining ships and rafts. Among the vessels targeted was the destroyer Asashio, which had lingered to recover survivors. During these operations, Asashio was struck by a 500-pound, 230-kilogram bomb from a B-7 aircraft while engaged in rescue efforts for the crew of Arashio. The destroyer sank rapidly, taking aboard with it a portion of the rescued personnel. The U.S. justification for these attacks combined both tactical strategy and a desire for retaliation. As noted in James Duffy's War at the End of the World, a B-17 bomber nicknamed Double Trouble, flown by Lieutenant Woodrow W. Moore, had collided with a Japanese Zero. 7 crew members parachuted to safety, only to be gunned down by enemy aircraft while helplessly descending. The incident incited outrage among American pilots, and General Kenny later described the subsequent air operations over survivors as mopping up missions. In the days that followed, Allied and Australian air crews repeatedly returned to the disaster site. Their patrols methodically scoured the waters for Japanese survivors, strafing lifeboats and rafts under Kenny's orders. Reports from March 20, 1943 confirmed that the attacks persisted until nightfall. Any Japanese who evaded aerial gunfire often found themselves adrift at least 30 miles from land in waters teeming with man-eating sharks.
Meanwhile, Japanese submarines I-17 and I-26 conducted rescue missions, carefully maneuvering to avoid detection by Allied aircraft. On March 6th, these submarines successfully retrieved 170 survivors. 2 days later, I-26 recovered another 54 personnel, transferring them to shore at Lae. The submarine's limited capacity meant hundreds remained stranded. The rescuers reported harrowing scenes, cries echoing through the darkness, survivors coated in oil, too weak to climb aboard, and the agonizing necessity of choosing whom to save. The human toll was staggering. Of the roughly 6,900 troops destined for New Guinea, only about 1,200 reached their intended destination at Lae. Another 2,700 were evacuated by destroyers and submarines back to Rabaul. Approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors perished. Allied losses were comparatively minimal, totaling 4 aircraft and 13 airmen. The resulting casualty ratio, approximately 230 to 1, was unprecedented in naval engagements. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented a decisive turning point. In the aftermath, Japanese commanders refrained from risking large convoys in waters dominated by Allied air power. Surface reinforcements for garrisons within range of Allied aircraft became a strategic impossibility for Japan. After the war, Captain Tommy Hara, who had commanded the destroyer Shigure, and was not present during the battle, compiled survivor interviews into what became the most widely cited Japanese assessment of the engagement. The operation turned out to be an unparalleled disaster, a stark contrast to the orderly and successful withdrawal from Guadalcanal. Interviews with those who survived revealed the profound psychological toll the defeat inflicted on Japanese forces. The loss at the Bismarck Sea was staggering, far beyond what anyone had anticipated. This engagement also highlighted the dramatic evolution in aerial combat tactics that caught the Japanese entirely off guard. The combination of skip bombing and heavily armed strafing aircraft transformed medium bombers into highly effective anti-ship platforms. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, these tactics became a key strategy against Imperial Japanese Navy vessels and transport ships. Major William Benn of the 63rd Squadron, 43rd Bomb Group, Heavy, 5th Air Force, United States Air Forces, implemented these methods with devastating effect in the South.
Innovations by Major Paul Pappy Guns further amplified this destructive capacity. He modified aircraft into what could be described as flying battleships, equipping versions of the A-20 and B-25 with between 8 and 14 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. These heavily armed planes could systematically neutralize anti-aircraft defenses before delivering bombs at dangerously close range. Not all who survived the initial attacks perished at sea. Some small groups managed to reach nearby islands, initiating desperate struggles to survive. One contingent of 18 made it to Kirwina Island, but was subsequently captured by PT-114. Another group reached Guadalcanal only to be killed by an American patrol. On Goodenough Island, Australian units conducted systematic searches for Japanese survivors. Between March 8 and 14, 1943, patrols from the 47th Infantry Battalion located and killed 72 Japanese soldiers, captured 42 more, and discovered 9 additional bodies on a raft. The Japanese forces were unaware until after the war that their convoy had been compromised from the outset. Allied intelligence had intercepted preparations for the convoy, and codebreakers in Melbourne as well as in Washington, D.C., had decrypted messages revealing the convoy's intended route and arrival schedule. Every aspect, the composition of the ships, timing, and exact path was known to the Allies. Confident that their communications were secure, the Japanese inadvertently sailed into a meticulously prepared trap. For Japan's military, steeped in the Bushido code, the slaughter in the Bismarck Sea created a deep cultural and moral shock. Bushido emphasized honor, respect for enemies, and dignity in defeat. The systematic killing of incapacitated men in the water violated all these principles. Survivors who returned to Rabaul were profoundly affected. They had witnessed a level of American ruthlessness that contradicted all previous portrayals of U.S. forces as weak or ineffectual. The sight of planes methodically hunting men in the water left an indelible impression on Japanese troops across the Pacific. Many survivors reported that the experience shattered their belief in the possibility of victory. If Americans would gun down defenseless men adrift at sea, what limits could be expected in combat? This psychological shock contributed to a mindset in which Japanese soldiers felt compelled to fight to the death rather than consider surrender, convinced that capture equaled certain execution. The morality and legality of strafing shipwrecked survivors remain debated. International law dictates that helpless shipwrecked personnel should be protected, though its application to enemy combatants who had not formally surrendered was ambiguous. It is also important to recognize that Japanese forces had committed numerous atrocities, including the Nanjing Massacre, the Bataan Death March, and the shooting of American airmen descending by parachute. Yet the Bismarck Sea incident differed in nature. It was a calculated effort to achieve tactical objectives, rather than an act driven by cruelty.
It is also important to recognize that Japanese forces had committed numerous atrocities, including the Nanjing Massacre, the Bataan Death March, and the shooting of American airmen descending by parachute. Yet the Bismarck Sea incident differed in nature. It was a calculated effort to achieve tactical objectives rather than an act driven by cruelty. American veterans defended their actions as a matter of operational necessity rather than moral failing. The targets were not defenseless prisoners, but armed enemy troops attempting to reach reinforcement positions. Many of these soldiers were perilously close to the coastline, sometimes as near as 10 to 15 miles, leaving open the possibility that they could have made it to shore. The catastrophic outcome at the Bismarck Sea forced Japanese High Command to rethink their naval strategy entirely. Admiral Minichi Koga, who assumed leadership after Admiral Yamamoto, came to the stark realization that conventional surface ships were extremely vulnerable in regions dominated by hostile aircraft. As a result, Japanese forces effectively withdrew from New Guinea, acknowledging that holding the territory was no longer feasible. The psychological consequences for Japanese troops were immediate and severe. Units awaiting transport reported unusually high rates of desertion, driven by the overwhelming fear of being intercepted and destroyed by American aircraft while at sea. The terror of aerial attacks in many cases outweighed the dread of ground combat itself. For the Americans, the engagement demonstrated a decisive lesson. Air power, when correctly deployed from land bases and supported with proper equipment and training, could neutralize naval forces without the need for aircraft carriers. This understanding had a lasting impact on U.S. strategy across the Pacific theater for the remainder of the war. After hostilities ended, the question of whether the strafing attacks constituted a violation of international law was quietly discussed. However, no prosecutions took place. The official stance maintained that the victims were enemy combatants who still posed a threat if they had reached the shore. The absence of legal action against American forces, in contrast to the execution of Japanese officers for similar wartime actions, highlighted the starkly one-sided nature of post-war justice, sometimes referred to as victor's justice. Both belligerents engaged in extreme brutality, yet only the defeated faced formal retribution.
Historians now regard the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as a turning point in the evolution of aerial combat. The numerical outcome was striking. All 8 Japanese transport ships and 4 destroyers were obliterated, resulting in around 3,000 Japanese fatalities, while the Allies suffered the loss of merely 13 airmen. Beyond the statistics, the engagement symbolized a profound shift in how wars could be waged. Air power had emerged as a dominant force capable of reshaping the conduct of naval operations entirely. Advances in technology and intelligence had reached a point where battlefield losses were no longer measured by traditional standards, but by sheer, overwhelming slaughter. Images of aircraft sweeping across enemy positions, systematically targeting defenseless soldiers, came to symbolize the unrelenting brutality of the Pacific theater. General Douglas MacArthur described this confrontation as the pivotal aerial clash of the Southwest Pacific Campaign, a judgment later validated by subsequent events. Following the encounter, Japan lost any chance of regaining the strategic upper hand in New Guinea. The engagement at the Bismarck Sea underscored a profound shift in modern warfare. Victory was no longer solely determined by clashes between organized armies, but by the combination of air supremacy, intelligence, and technological innovation capable of inflicting near-total destruction. For Japanese forces, the battle signaled the beginning of a decline in the Southwest Pacific. Cut off from reinforcements and supplies due to Allied control of the skies, isolated garrisons were left vulnerable to attrition and eventual annihilation. For the United States, the episode marked a stark transformation. The nation that had been paralyzed by the surprise of Pearl Harbor had now developed the capacity to systematically eliminate thousands of enemy troops with precision and efficiency.
Yet the harsh tactics employed, particularly the strafing of survivors, highlight the ethical ambiguities inherent in modern conflict, raising questions about the moral costs of technological and strategic dominance in war. The clash between operational necessity and the principles of humanitarian conduct became starkly evident in the oil-stained waters of the Bismarck Sea. During this confrontation, both sides came face to face with the harsh realities of total war, where traditional ethical and tactical limits were repeatedly ignored. Over the course of 3 days in March 1943, Allied air forces, primarily American and Australian, systematically obliterated a Japanese convoy, resulting in the deaths of thousands of soldiers and effectively cutting off any chance of reinforcing New Guinea by maritime routes.
The surviving Japanese personnel were left traumatized by the sight of Allied aircraft attacking helpless men floating in the water. These experiences inflicted deep psychological scars and reshaped Japanese perceptions of American combat methods, revealing an enemy capable of calculated ruthlessness, far beyond prior expectations. The battle not only achieved immediate strategic objectives, but also marked a turning point in understanding the evolving nature of modern warfare. It highlighted the unprecedented power of air dominance over sea movements and underscored the critical importance of intelligence in planning and executing operations. At the same time, it exposed the moral complexity inherent in total war, where the distinction between combatant and non-combatant could become tragically blurred. The methodical killing of survivors remains one of the most disturbing images from the Pacific theater, emphasizing that the conflict often involved calculated destruction rather than valorous combat. By the end of the engagement, roughly 3,000 Japanese troops had perished in the waters of the Bismarck Sea, victims not of a traditional battle, but of systematic aerial assault. The few who survived returned with a lasting awareness of the Americans' willingness to engage in extreme measures, a realization that profoundly influenced Japanese military mindset for the remainder of the war. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea also illustrated a broader strategic lesson. In technologically advanced warfare, superiority in equipment and coordination could translate directly into near-total annihilation of enemy forces. The Japanese, confronted with an adversary capable of uncompromising lethality, recognized that their opponents had become far more formidable than previous intelligence or propaganda had suggested. This grim understanding, forged in blood and fear over a brief 3-day period, foreshadowed the increasingly severe and uncompromising nature of the Pacific War, a trajectory that would continue until its dramatic and catastrophic conclusion with the atomic bombings.